Hi, everybody. I'm Kals. I am the co-founder and general partner of Eye Ventures, an early stage VC fund for Pakistan. And for those that do know me and follow me, this is not an episode of my podcast, The Comparable. This is just a conversation that I thought was important to have with a friend of mine, Uzair, because it is something that he has talked about quite frequently and also has written a book about. We're going to be talking about that today with everything that's happening and the chaos in the world with the war with Iran that has now left reverberations throughout the world. I thought this was a really good opportunity to kind of bring up the thesis of his book. It's actually fun because typically whenever we've appeared on these things, you're the one interviewing me. So it's great to turn the tables a little bit here. But Uzair, for those who don't know, is a partner and chief product officer at the Asia Group, a strategy and business advisory group to organizations with business interests across Asia. He's a frequent commentator, analyst, and writer of the intersection of economics, technology, and geopolitics in emerging markets. And he is the author of Future Ready, Innovation, Abundance in the Global South, which I have my little trusty copy here that is heavily highlighted generally, but also as I was kind of doing a lot of rereading to prepare for this conversation, I really realized the thesis of this book, there's no truer time to really talk about it than right now with what's happening in the world is there. So excited for this conversation and thanks for being with me.
No, and it's one of those things, right? Like you write a book about scarcity of energy and a
Yes.
potential era of abundance, and here we are. Everyone's
Exactly.
talking
And
about
I
scarcity of
literally
energy.
texted you. I was like, what a crazy time. We should bring your book back up again because
Yeah.
I feel like there's such a good time to re-talk about it because I feel like we bringing it up in a crisis is kind of the wrong time to talk about it, but it's also no better time to say it. So, as I mentioned, and everyone in the world at this point knows, we're almost a month into the US and Israel initiated war with Iran, which has led to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which has choked off around 20% of the global oil supply. This in turn has triggered what is called a generational global energy crisis. Whatever word you want to use, it is a massive crisis right now with reverberations that are being felt everywhere. For countries like Pakistan, which imports around 40% of our total energy supply, energy shocks like these can cause major economic implications and already is. And as I mentioned, I reached out to you because the thesis of your book, Future Ready, talked about situations like these, noting that the scarcity of energy and capital is connected to the scarcity of productivity. You also argue that Pakistan and countries that are part of the global south are not condemned to scarcity and can move towards abundance. So I would love to understand a little bit, bringing it into your book, but also how you're thinking about things like right now. How does the current energy shock in Pakistan test your thesis?
So, before this conversation, I was thinking about something over the weekend, and I want to sort of go back in time a bit. In the last major oil price shock that happened in 1973. And many of your listeners who are from emerging markets, those of us who grew up in Pakistan, still to this day know of people who swear by the Honda 70cc motorcycle.
Totally.
The Honda 70cc motorcycle is an outcome of that energy supply shock coming out of Japan. Because Japan, that was the first time, and Honda's own history web pages talk about this, that the oil price shock sent Japan into its first recession since the Second World War. And because Japan, even to this day, is an energy importer, that had reverberations for their economy, but also in America and other countries that had energy abundance, it caused long lines and shocks. And as a result of that, Japanese cars, Japanese motorcycles, etc., that were built for efficiency, and engines that were built for efficiency became super popular. So here we are in this moment right now with another energy price shock. And what I anticipate out of this energy price shock coming out in the medium term is basically what Pakistan has been ahead of the curve on compared to many other emerging markets, which is the rapid adoption of solar and distributed energy systems. And now that the technology is there and China actually has an overcapacity of battery storage systems, the proliferation of those is going to accelerate in the coming years. And I think this will happen primarily because unlike the previous oil price shocks that we've had, including in 2008, where the technology really wasn't there in terms of providing people an alternative. Now there is consumer grade technology, whether it's BYD's electric vehicles, whether it's battery energy storage systems provided by companies like Anchor, etc. You will have households and businesses increasingly say, hang on a minute, yes, for certain tasks that are energy intensive, like smelting aluminum or whatever, or making fertilizer, we still need fossil fuels and we need these supplies. But on a day-to-day basis, we are in a position to look at alternatives, and that transition, I think, is going to accelerate rather dramatically. And in Pakistan, it accelerated actually after the Russia-Ukraine war, which was again an energy price shock for the country. And so I anticipate that citizens around the world, particularly in the global south, are going to solarize much more rapidly in the months to come.
Do you think that we're not going to, my only concern is, given that like we're seeing so many, we're seeing news stories about the fact that Iran is allowing, just given like the relationship that Pakistan has with Iran, they are allowing some Pakistan ships to go through the Strait of Hormuz. Do you feel like maybe this could also punt the conversation, or do you really see that strategically we'll look at this as an opportunity again to lean into how we invest in other technologies?
I don't think there's an opportunity to punt, right? Because even if you get the supply, like I was talking to a journalist this morning who had this exact question. And my view was it's not about the quantity of shock in the supply side, it's the price. Pakistan and many countries cannot afford to pay north of $80 a barrel for oil and associated products for a long period of time. 3 months is a lot for even a country like Pakistan, right? Like you will have pressures on exchange rate, pressures on payments. We're not even talking about fertilizer prices at this point. In the pandemic, I had this case study that I used to tell people of, like you had supply chain shocks that led to stops in exports of jeans out of Pakistan. And the reason was that YKK makes the zippers and the zippers weren't available. So you had the whole thing where you didn't have zippers. Right now you have helium shortages coming down the pipe because of what's happened in the Strait of Hormuz. So I think it's the price issue that will force policymakers and citizens alike to sort of say, hang on a minute, what are alternatives that we can look at? And I remember when I was researching this book, I was talking to one of my colleagues in India about this. One of this crazy harebrained idea that I had was like, hey, what if we took decentralized solar, put it on a rooftop, and instead of giving citizens a subsidy for LPG cylinders, what if we made, and through that solar program, provided access to small induction stovetops to women in rural India, or rural Pakistan, rural Bangladesh? Sounds like a crazy idea when I was writing my book, so I never really put it in there. But now that
But
you
you
look at
kind
the
of
LPG
referred
prices,
to parts of it, though. You talked about like community-driven
exactly.
solar. Yeah.
Exactly. So you now have, for example, in India, LPG shocks going through the entire economy where businesses are shutting down, people are moving back to their villages because there are no jobs in the services industry because of the price shock, right? And India can afford, compared to other countries, to pay a bit more for LPG, but its citizens cannot afford to pay that much. And that's what's really going to cause, in my opinion, this transition to accelerate.
One thing you talked about in your book was that often, so citizens do obviously feel the shock, but in countries like Pakistan, because we're trying to shield citizens from feeling as much of the shock as it really is, as it is really there, sometimes governments, that's when we have like subsidies and things like that that end up actually hurting the country even more. And just like, thinking about some of the austerity measures that are in place right now to help manage the shocks, what would you say, like, what would an abundance response look like in an energy crisis like this? And where is that opportunity currently? You've kind of already talked about that, but I'm curious about like, what does the abundance response look like?
So, and this is the tragedy, right? Like my view on this was post Russia-Ukraine conflict, when Pakistani households did and businesses did start to solarize rather dramatically. Pakistan now has over 30 gigawatts of distributed solar capacity across the board. The government and the bureaucracy administering the power sector adopted the scarcity mindset and said, hang on a minute, this is risking the grid. And so we're going to start penalizing you as net metering prosumers and change your contracts, and we're going to like tinker with the system to force you to buy from the grid, buy this really inefficient, expensive electricity supply. And of course, there was a pushback over the last few months, as you and I have followed in Pakistan, about this. The prime minister then changed the policy, etc. And now I joke with those same people who are on the other side that, hey, if it wasn't for this 30 gigawatts of solar, Pakistan's electricity crisis in the midst of this war would be even worse. But now that we're in spring and summer, these same prosumers with 30 gigawatts of capacity are actually helping you save billions of dollars of energy imports. So maybe let's start looking at that as part of the agenda moving forward, reimagine our grid, right? And over there, I would say there are two things to do. The first, in the immediate term, I would say that yes, the government in particular, for less privileged segments of society, your motorcycle owners, your rickshaw owners, etc., you need to give them a subsidy. You cannot just unilaterally price on all of the price changes to them. But what you then have to plan for is say, okay, I am going to over time make this imported fuel more and more expensive for my consumers. Like Pakistan consumes like a very high proportion of its petroleum product imports for motorcycle and rickshaw consumption. So then the abundance criteria should say, I'm going to force a change in the kind of mobility that exists in my system by electrifying mobility. And that part of it can be connected. This is part of the long-term thinking you have to have, right? You say, okay, you're a motorcycle owner. I'm going to give you a cash transfer of a specific amount to smooth your expenses right now in this pinch. And I'm not going to give you the full price impact of the shock that is coming. We're going to absorb it, particularly for vulnerable segments. But through that, now I have a data set of how many million consumers that I subsidize over time who are motorcycle owners, etc. Through the cash transfer by creating mobile wallet, which is I link to capital in my book as well, right? If you link those two things together, now you have a trace of how the money is spent by this household, by this person that owns it. So now you, in many ways, have created money to subsidize them, but at the same time also created a credit profile about how this person spends money, what their spending patterns are, etc. Now, post-crisis, you connect those two and you say, okay, your next upgrade for your rickshaw, for your motorcycle, is going to be an electric rickshaw or an electric motorcycle. And now we're transitioning people over to this abundance platform of saying, solarize, buy EVs, we're going to support you through that transition, and we're going to make this the last big energy shock we face in the way that consumers are facing. Now, I know a lot of people, when I say this, say, well, energy intensity matters, and so you can't solarize everything, you can't have batteries for everything. I agree. But I'm talking about a big chunk of the economy, mobility on a day-to-day basis, that can and should be electrified to make sure that the country is on much more stable footing and has abundance at this micro level, so that we reimagine the grid and we prevent households from facing the same crush that they're facing right now in this crisis.
I think a criticism of governments and regimes in the past in Pakistan is that often they're not doing kind of the necessary, what you're saying, right? Is like you kind of have to do that initial work and have that long-term strategic thinking, because everyone comes from that place of scarcity. Everyone's always thinking about, like, from a short-term perspective, I may not last this long, so I'm not necessarily putting the foundations in place that are necessary for that type of abundance that should exist. Do you have more confidence in the current regime right now that they are doing those things, that they are putting the things in place that would lead to that kind of long-term impact in comparison to other past governments?
I think we're kind of there since the last crisis in Pakistan, and the way I describe this is, there's research on the economic side about the psychological impacts of high rates of inflation on a society. Germany being one of the most studied ones because of how high inflation went over there between World War II and World War I and World War II. And I think Pakistan went through a similar phase with inflation reaching as high as 38% a couple of years ago. And that shifted people's mindset about the mistakes that were made by printing more money, by following bad policy, by giving this broad subsidy out to all segments of society equally, where in fact the Land Cruiser owner was benefiting more from a fuel subsidy than a motorcycle owner, right? I think those lessons have been learned. I think where the gap still exists is in terms of letting, um, not letting, but sort of forgetting the crisis after it's done, and then going back to ground zero, right? So if I were sort of hopeful of one thing post the Russia Ukraine crisis and things and the way Pakistan was impacted, I would have wanted to see this motorcycle subsidy program and the sort of architecture of that should have been developed 2 years ago. It wasn't. So now we're rolling out this haphazard app, which I and myself and many other people in the technology space don't think it's a great idea to roll out a population scale app in the midst of a crisis. It's a bad idea. Just give them
Yeah.
mobile wallet money, much more efficient. But that's where we are. So, but I think there are learnings happening, and maybe not in this government or another government, but across different segments of political parties in the military, et cetera, to sort of say, hang on a minute, we have an identity program, we have RAS, the digital payments program, we have mass adoption to a large degree of broadband mobile internet. Why can't we connect all of these things to
Yeah.
give our citizens access to cash and money and supplies when they need it? And how can we now, people are beginning to think about, how can we now incentivize through those systems changes of behavior, changes of consumption that make things better in Pakistan?
I think that's a really good point. It also leads to what I wanted to pivot and talk about as well is, this is such a different time that we're living in right now in Pakistan. You mentioned Ross and the fact that our instant payment system is live. Generally, our digital public infrastructure is much stronger today than it was a couple of years ago. Smartphone penetration is increased. And specifically, very recently, what just happened was, we had a spectrum auction that just happened in terms of increasing our broadband, the spectrum of our broadband connectivity. And typically, our past spectrum auctions have actually gone with unused, no one has actually bought into it. But for this time, we had three major telecom operators, Jazz, Ufone, and Zong, agree to acquire and bought it to acquire a total of 480 megahertz across four core mobile bands for $510 million, right? Which is a really big deal. It also was a sign that those operators were actually excited by the vision that was demonstrated by the Pakistan Telecom Communications Authority as well as the Ministry of IT. So all signs are good, right? That they were excited by the vision that was being showcased. That's why they bought into it. It also means that, because you talk about this in your book of like, people wanting to be productive, but like things like 3G was really slow to roll out in Pakistan. Right now, with things like this happening, it means that 5G can actually roll out. It means that not only will people be more connected in the country, but the quality of that connection is going to be much, much higher, which when you kind of time it with what's happening with instant payments, people paying with via QR codes is what they're using their phones for. And I would love for you to comment a little bit on this, right? Because you talk about, not just the scarcity of energy and capital, but the scarcity of productivity, which I think is how they're all interlinked with each other. Will efforts like these lead to that increase in productivity that you talk about? And what else needs to occur? You've kind of started to talk about this already. What else needs to occur to make this translate into something that's more transformative?
Yeah, so the 5G auction is super exciting, and I was on the receiving end of a failed startup venture because of 3G rollout
You
in
mentioned it
Pakistan,
in your book,
and I
yeah.
write in my book as well, right? So it never came around in time for us to take off. So I think just on that entrepreneurial spirit, right? Like you can imagine the scale at which the slow rollout of 3G, what the impact was, what the impact to this date, in my opinion, of like not making Nadra more of a public utility to allow people to identify people through rails, right? That's been a big loss in Pakistan, and I tell non-Pakistanis very often that India may have the largest public utility identity systems in the world through Aadhaar. Pakistan was there first. Pakistan
Yeah.
has never scaled it in that way, right? That's the
Yeah.
tragedy here. And so I think the 5G auction is really, really exciting. The other fun fact I'll say, again, connecting to the energy side, right? One of the largest like sectoral consumers of diesel in Pakistan are mobile towers because the grid is not super reliable. So you can imagine what could happen just in terms of modernization if these towers either were given more reliable grid access to electricity or solarize, which some are already beginning to do because of just the cost dynamics, right? So that's also, this investment can accelerate part of this transition in Pakistan as well. And I think coming to the productivity side, when you look at where the world is going in terms of decentralized access to computing, what people are beginning to do from their homes in terms of businesses, internet connectivity has become central for everything from delivery of food to people's homes, to e-commerce shipments, quick commerce, how businesses transact and share financial transactions. I think all of this will take off, right? And I think that's basically, in shorthand in my book I get to is an increase in the velocity of money and increase in the velocity of commerce. And when you do that, that's when growth gets unlocked, right? So I think there's an opportunity to get that right. The one thing I would be cautious on, and I would advise policymakers to think a bit more about this, is the shorthand for 5G spectrum is, oh, my video streaming or my social media consumption, my YouTube streams will be all much more efficient. And I think that's like the bad way to look at more access to data and compute. More data, more compute can allow your society to connect their industrial parks much better, to provide better access to, let's say, traffic monitoring and management systems in urban environments, can provide Wi-Fi hotspots to underprivileged communities who may not be able to afford high-speed Wi-Fi at their home at all times. So connecting schools to the fiber, for example, is important. So I think I would like them to take a broader view of the fact that just consumer consumption of data is not good enough. Yes, it's important, and building that infrastructure is important, but making sure that you put it to productive use, whether it is through educational initiatives, access to Wi-Fi in the public domain, connecting infrastructure. I think that has to be the next goal here out of this 5G auction, because that's really where the productivity gains will start to kick in.
What I liked about, kind of going back to your book and then having this conversation with you is that this is actually an opportunity that we can really think about right now. And maybe this is the time that we can be like thinking about how all these puzzle pieces that have started to be put in place, as you mentioned, not just now, but when it happened with the Russia-Ukraine war, some of those pieces plus what's happening on the digital infrastructure side can all kind of lend itself to the rails that we can build things on right now. What do you think is important to keep in mind right now as we're thinking about the impact of all of this, but also the opportunity for what it means, for yourself?
So I think what's important for people is to think about and pay attention to the fact that we are sort of going through these extremely volatile and tragic times, yes. But much like the interwar period between World War I and World War II, there's an insane amount of innovation coming online as well. And that innovation is going to change the very nature of societies, markets, businesses, etc. And I make this argument in my book as well that if the last 300 or so years, right, of global modernization, economic growth, etc., was one built on industrialization, and industrialization requires centralization of human labor, capital, and talent, and governance, what we are now seeing is the emergence of decentralized forms of modernization, whether it's energy, whether it is compute and data, and whether it is tools for productivity, 3D printing, decentralized manufacturing, etc. And I think if you're looking at it from the industrialized world's perspective, which is, the global north, as one would say it, you're kind of missing the real innovation, exponential growth coming out of that. And what I mean by that is, if you look at Great Britain, Industrial Revolution happens, and Great Britain at that time was a backwater. It didn't have the legacy infrastructure that India did, China did, Ottoman Empire did, right? And so it was able to think out of the blue and build all of the infrastructure for the Industrial Revolution, and then Europe did the same. So a society and a civilization that was really far behind leapfrogged ahead. And I think we need to keep this in mind as founders and investors in the global south, that the things that may work in America and Europe are unlikely to be the ones that are actually needed in a Pakistan, a Nigeria, or a Bangladesh, or in India. You have to think outside of the box in terms of what are the ways in which this technology can be scaled for the business use cases and the solutions that are needed in that society. And the beauty, if you start thinking about it, is that in that part of the world, there just isn't that legacy ecosystem to push back against you, right? So people here in Washington often ask me now that these days between the US and Pakistan, there's a lot of focus on crypto. Like, why is Pakistan so all in on crypto? And I'm like, if you're following, and you and I were on the Atlantic Council like paper, we wrote a
We
paper
wrote
together
about
on
it,
this,
yeah.
right? And the thing was like because people felt the pinch of a sovereign that had just printed a lot of money, and they
Totally.
saw alternative assets like Bitcoin and said, I'm going to adopt this because screw the sovereign, like it just continues to destroy my savings. And so Pakistan is a big adopter of crypto, and that only happens when you don't have legacy systems, or legacy systems have failed so much that people are innovating and adopting on the edges. And that's what's happening in all over the global south. And I think that's what makes this transition very, very exciting, because you can have a decentralized peer-to-peer solar grid market in a Bangladesh, which has been tested already in Bangladesh, for example. I looked into that for my research. You can have that everywhere. You can't have this very easily in Europe or America because it's a highly regulated sector. But you go to rural Africa, and all of a sudden this is possible because guess what? The grid doesn't exist there. So anybody who provides a P2P solar enabled grid for people to make money off of, they will adopt it and they will say thank you very much.
Anything else that's really exciting for you right now?
I think the other big thing that's exciting to me, and again, this comes to education, and my dear friend Dr. Ali Hasnan at LUMS always reminds me of that yes, these technologies are great, and they're exciting and they can be revolutionary, but without human capital, you don't go anywhere. And that is a big gap in Pakistan and many of the emerging markets and global south markets. And so to me, what's exciting about the innovation where we're at right now is, again, we talked about 5G and broadband access. With 5G and broadband access, there is no reason for a child in, let's say, a small rural town in Pakistan or Nigeria or Somalia to not have access to Harvard quality of education anymore in their own local language. To me, that is the most exciting part of the future, where people who have been historically disconnected from great education because of a lack of teachers or because of a lack of education in their own mother tongue, people often forget that's a big barrier, right? Will no longer have that barrier, because through artificial intelligence, machine translation, machine learning, etc., you can make this possible. So to me, that's the other most exciting part, is that if we're looking to solve for the human capital and talent problem, which hundreds of millions of people over decades left behind because they were smart, they knew what to do, they just did not have the ability to access education in a language and in a methodology and a system that they could understand, and they were just left out. Now they won't be left out, the next generation. They shouldn't be left out. And if I think, again, startups and businesses get that part right, all of a sudden or governments get that part right, all of a sudden you're looking at, within a generation, less than 20 years, an entire transformation of your human capital pool that is built for the AI age, that has Harvard levels of education for a fraction of the cost. And I think that is like amazing if countries start to figure that out.
Yeah, I'm excited about that too. So, thanks, Uzair, for being part of this conversation. You've left me optimistic about what we can do next. So,
Yeah,
thank
one
you.
has to be optimistic, and I say, stay safe and stay sane is the motto these days.